It's Theo from Theo's Tech Tips, and in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to use promises with JavaScript. Let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is open up your code editor. I use Visual Studio Code, and I'm just going to create a new project for the demo. Alright, so I have my JavaScript file opened and it is in a HTML environment, so it will run. And I think at this point, I need to explain a bit how promises work. So JavaScript is asynchronous by nature. So what asynchronous means is that code will usually tend to run separated from the main process. And a perfect example of that is with JavaScript callbacks. So for those of you who don't know, a JavaScript callback is usually when you have a piece of code that needs to be executed, but it might take some time and you don't know when that's going to happen. So you use a callback to return it. So I'm just going to do a bit of an example on that. So if I have a function and I just go like hi, so what you would do is pass in your callback here, and then you would run something that is intense, like a database query or something that will take too long. The idea of asynchronous code is that it doesn't want to slow down the main process. So like say you do your database query here, and then because it took up so much time, in fact, sometimes the database query will usually be in a callback of its own. So I would just go like run query, and then I just do like my database query here. And then what run query would do is it would call my callback. So I would pass in my callback over here, and it is usually an anonymous function. So that looks like this. It's basically just a function without a name. So this is now my callback. So then what I want to do is I'm going to invoke callback here. So I just run the callback because it's expecting callback to be a function. And then you could just pass in parameters like hi. So I'm just going to make a dummy function called run query to demonstrate this a bit. So this is now my run query function. Obviously, database libraries will be a lot more complicated than this, but this is just like a simulation. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run hi, but because there's no return value on it, if I just go return hi, it's going to return nothing, even though the output is supposed to be hi, because it is asynchronous. So it's detached from the hi process. It's in a new one over here, which means that this is going to, if I used return instead, it would return to run query instead of hi, because that's the nature of JavaScript. So actually, I'm going to do this right now. I'm going to save. So now I'm going to test it by printing the output here to the console. So I ran it and I got the output that I was actually expecting. So it gave me an error, and that's basically because I did not specify a parameter into here. Say if I did and I passed in the right parameters, another callback here, it would return undefined. And there it is, undefined. Because this console.log would be printing the return value of hi. And because there is no return value, it's inside here. It's supposed to run the callback. So in order to run this, I'm going to have to get rid of the console.log. And then take my data over here. And then put it like this. And now you can see it does work. But the problem with this is that if this isn't going to work because it's fast enough, but like if it was slower, like a real database query, this is going to wait for hi to finish. It's just going to blast right through it, and then it'll get called later. So your whole thing has to be nested inside of this. And that's kind of the idea of promises. So promises is basically just a modern version of a callback, but it has a secret or a superpower that makes it a lot more special than a normal callback. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this with promises. So instead of a callback, we actually aren't going to run anything. All we have to do is return in our function a new promise. And then this takes an undefined function, but it doesn't really treat it like a callback. So in this function, it'll actually give you a parameter called resolve. So then you would put your query in here. And then instead of running a callback, because there isn't any, you would call resolve. So I'm going to run this. Again, I'm going to run the exact same test by printing it out first. And by executing this, you will see that because it took so fast, the promise is already resolved. But the idea is this returns a promise, not nothing. So if it was something more intense like a database query, which I can't actually show because this isn't a server, but it wouldn't actually say resolve. In fact, what I can show you is a common use that you will see all over JavaScript. So since JavaScript is asynchronous and not synchronous, some of the choices are structured differently. So in Python or Ruby, I could just go like sleep and then how many milliseconds, and then I'll wait for this to be done and then move on to the code. Well, JavaScript doesn't have that because it's asynchronous. So what they have is instead set timeout, which you can pass a number of milliseconds, but it doesn't wait on it. It takes a callback. And as we know, it will not wait for that callback to be done. So first I'm going to show you what that's going to look like with promises, and then I'm going to get into the promises secret weapon. So the first thing we want to do is, of course, make a new function that says like make or like sleep. So now what we're going to do is run set timeout, which I just talked about, and then we are going to wait for 5 seconds, which is 5,000 milliseconds. And this takes a callback, of course, as we already discussed. And then we're just going to go resolve. And because we're not passing any parameters, they'll look like this. So now what I'm going to do is do the same test. I'm going to print sleep. And I'm going to run this, and you'll see promise status pending because it isn't resolved at the time of printing it out. So in order to get when it's printed out, like run something when it's printed out, keep in mind this is still asynchronous. We haven't gotten to the synchronous stuff yet. But in order to do this properly, we need to do something to this promise class. So the promise class has a method that's called then and catch. So if there's an error, it'll give it to catch, and then if there's none, we'll give it to then. Now I'm just gonna ignore catch for now, but it will basically take a block of code, once again an anonymous function, and run it like this. So as you can see, after 5 seconds of waiting, it printed it out. But the problem with this is not synchronous. As you can see, I can actually show you this. This isn't going to wait on the promise. Like I could go console.log start and console.log end. And you can see start and end are going to be called before hi is called. See, your pattern looks like this. What you'd want is it to say start, hi, and then end. So in order to do that, we need to talk about the promises secret weapon. Because promises are pretty useless by themselves. Like they are a little bit more powerful than callbacks, but they're still pretty much a callback, but in a class. So in order to do this better, we need to turn this into synchronous code using something called async and await. So the real superpower here is await, because what await does is it basically lets you wait till a promise is resolved before it keeps going, basically turning it into synchronous code. So because await is only valid in async functions, we're gonna have to make a new function called async function run. Now you can use an anonymous sync function, but for this just seems easier and simpler. So we're basically just going to do the exact same thing, but instead of doing this blob of code, I'm going to rewrite this. So as you know, this returns a promise. So all you have to do is go await the secret power and then go sleep. Now, of course, we need to invoke our function here. So now you can see start, but end hasn't been called yet. So as you can see, we just got ourselves some synchronous code, because synchronous code means that it did not detach from the main process. And as you can see, we are still in the main process. So basically what this allows us to do is wait 5 seconds, which is a new thing, and then print end. And as you saw, this totally works. We basically just added a sleep function to JavaScript. So this is extremely useful because you don't want to enter callback doom. And what callback doom is when you have a ton of callbacks. So this isn't a real function, so this isn't actually going to run. But say we have a ton of callbacks like this. Everything is to run inside that callback if you want it to get the data that was in here. So then, what if you want to run a different thing? Well, that is going to have to run again. But now you have to say data 2 so that the variables are independent. And then, of course, you keep going. So this is really bad, and this is how you would used to write it. But now, because of new modern code practices, we now have promises that make everything easier. So instead of this, it's this. In fact, I could actually turn this into what it would look like with promises. As you can see, that is just so much cleaner. In fact, let's use await with some data. So because await will cause it to wait on the promise, await is going to make this promise, resolve it, and then pass the data into the return value of this await. So we have our sleep function here. I'm just going to resolve some data like hello world, classic programmer term. And then over here, we want to get the return value of this. So this is super simple. We just put it inside of a variable and then log that variable to the console. So what this code execution should be is print start, wait 5 seconds, then print hello world, because that should be the return value of data, and then print end. So let's see that. And there we go. It absolutely works. So that's the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Theo's Tech Tips, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.